Thank you all for being here. My name is Anika Austin, and I'm a collections processing archivist at the Rose Library and co-chair of the Rose Library Sustainability Committee, Environmental Sustainability. On behalf of the committee, I'm pleased and honored to welcome Eira Tansey, who will lead us through a day of watershed and documentation strategies related sessions. Eira is a leading expert on the impacts of climate change on archives with extensive research, teaching, and community building experience. Her research has been profiled in Nature, Vice, Pacific Standard, and Yale Climate Connections. She has written for a wide variety of archives, history, and environmental policy journals, and has written a highly impactful book, A Green New Deal for Archives, which tackles the pressing challenges faced by archives globally, including the immediate and long-term risks associated with climate change. Eira has a long-standing concern for water access and safety. She has supported local community activism efforts related to water quality standards in Cincinnati, where she is a resident of the Ohio River watershed. Her company, Emory Rising, was founded in 2022 on the premise of valuing climate change, labor, and local knowledge. Her keynote today will explore a topic we know all too well in Atlanta, and we'll look at lessons we can garner from how large infrastructure projects result in community displacement. So without further ado, thank you so much, Eira, and thank you guys for being here.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I also realize I actually do have to lean into the microphone a little bit here. Wave your hands in case you cannot hear me at any point. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you today in Atlanta, and I want to thank the Sustainability Committee for the invitation today, and especially to Anika and Aaron for their logistics help as well as their colleagues. This is probably the longest lead time I've ever had with someone reaching out to me, and then when I actually come on site, and that I think speaks to actually a real commitment to sustainability, this understanding that sometimes the best way to do things is to not rush into them, is to take it slow, and that level of care and generosity with how you've handled bringing me here today is, I just cannot express how much I appreciate it. So thank you so much for how well organized this has been on your part. So today is Earth Day, and the first Earth Day began in 1970. Began on April 22nd, and the choosing of the date of April 22nd is very deliberate because the organizers at the time wanted to capitalize on the campus student protest movements of the 1960s and the 70s. So at that time, April 22nd was a pretty reliable date for marking spring break. So the organizers at the time said, okay, well, if everyone's on spring break, then they can come out and do things for Earth Day. So we often might think of Earth Day as being a fairly kind of chill event like this, people with signs and banners, but that was not the case for every Earth Day event at the beginning. In some places, Earth Day was actually very confrontational, and it actually is quite evocative of some of the things we have seen from campus protest movements in recent years. So this was particularly the case at Boston, where a group of student protesters from Harvard University went to Logan Airport with coffins. And to describe what you're seeing in this photograph, because it might be a little hard to see, that back coffin says genocide on it, the one in the middle says biocide, and the one closest to the audience says racism. There are people in this photograph who are wearing masks. Now, not because of a pandemic or trying to evade state surveillance, but because this was actually a pretty common sight from Earth Day events in the early 1970s, because this was 2 to 3 years, someone who knows environmental policy can correct me on the date. So it was a few years before the passage of the Clean Air Act. And so urban air pollution was a real concern. So you often had people showing up with surgical masks or gas masks to Earth Day events. But of course, violence against student protesters is nothing new. And there are two things I want to point out about what you're seeing in this photograph. The first, of course, is that we have a police officer who is about to arrest or use their billy club on someone. And this takes place just a few weeks before the Kent State shootings. So the Kent State shootings is when the Ohio National Guard opens fire on anti-war protesters at Kent State University. That's May 4th, 1970. This is April 22nd, 1970. So we already have sort of this atmosphere of massive retaliation against student protesters in often quite violent ways. But the other thing too, and I think this is really, it's an evocative photograph because of the use of coffins. And it points to something that we often see in environmental discourse, which is how we locate sort of the causes of death, the causes of grief, and how we memorialize what has been lost. So those themes of memorializing what has been lost, recognizing loss, acknowledging grief, that is going to be a lot of the recurring themes in my time with you here today. So in the years and the decades since the first Earth Day, of course, oh, and I didn't mention what these students, why they went to the airport. So the reason they went to the airport was that there was one of the airline companies at the time was developing a new supersonic jet. And there were concerns that the atmospheric emissions of this jet would be really detrimental. So these students were really clocking what now we know, which is atmospheric emissions being a major part of climate change. So climate change is reshaping our communities. It depends on where we live, that level and degree of reshaping. But what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us is that for those of us in the world who are living near coastlines, around 1 billion people are going to be exposed. Now, if anything, that's a bit of an undercount in terms of how many people could be forced to relocate because of climate change, because there are many parts of the world that are far from any oceans where perhaps people, had an agricultural base for farming. There's now drought or desertification. And so if anything, the number of people who may have their communities impacted have to move because of climate change. If anything, 1 billion people is probably an understatement. But for now, let's just stick with thinking about the impacts to coastal areas. So when we think about coastal risk management, this graph here, which I realize is a little bit difficult to see, but I'll walk through it with you. We have different tools that we can use in our policy toolbox to deal with sea level rise. So there's things like building out different types of infrastructure. So building out things like seawalls, levees. You can talk about elevating buildings, but at a certain point, you can't outrun a rising sea. And so at some point, we are talking about, ideally, from the perspective of the United Nations, planned relocation. Now, here's the problem. Planned relocation. So let me take a brief moment to talk about planned relocation. This also sometimes goes by the term managed retreat. And it's the idea that if we know there are certain places in the world that are so vulnerable to rising seas due to climate change that living in those places will not be possible, say, 100 years from now, then there ought to be a managed sort of system of helping communities and people relocate. The reality of how this is working, particularly in the United States, is that we have what actually a law professor at Emory University, Mark Nevitt, calls unmanaged retreat. And that's what we are currently seeing today. So what we have, rather than an approach where we say, okay, I'm going to pick on Key West for a moment because Key West is a very special place to me. I've been there several times during important parts of my life. So parts of Key West likely will not be habitable within the next few decades due to its proximity to the sea, how fast the seas are rising. So right now, there's no sort of national adaptation plan, no national managed retreat plan in the United States for thinking about how we relocate people. Sometimes what you typically have, though, you might have some of this happening at the local and state government. It depends. But in reality, what's actually happening on the ground is kind of this the Spider-Man meme, where you have local and state governments that are saying, hey, we kind of see that there's some issues here, but we also don't want to spook homeowners and have people start pulling out. The federal government's saying, well, we don't have enough money for buyouts. The insurance companies are saying, well, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? And so you have a lot of these different parties that are pointing their fingers at each other. So what we have, instead of any kind of proactive planning in terms of thinking about what is the sort of circumstances in which people should live in a place for the next 100 years if we know eventually it will be underwater, we have a lot of reactive things happening. So let's say that there's a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane that comes through an area. Some people may want to rebuild, but then as they get down the rebuilding process, they find that an insurance company is no longer going to underwrite the mortgage for the new structure they're building. So people might say, you know what, screw it. I don't want to live here anymore. I don't want to deal with another hurricane season. So I'm going to relocate to, someplace further inland or go live with my children somewhere else. So this is what we are seeing across the United States right now, sort of a lack of coordination and very reactive ways to thinking about where we live in proximity to vulnerable areas. So this is sort of my question that I think about as an archivist, which is, if climate change is reshaping our communities, what archival records is going to reflect these changes, whether we're talking about a scenario of managed retreat, planned relocation, or a very ad hoc reactive situation like we have today. What documentation will exist of displaced communities? And if we don't have these records, what are going to be the consequences? And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So I want to switch gears briefly and talk about the community impacts of major infrastructure projects, because all infrastructure projects have major impacts. And I think for someone like me who, I live in Cincinnati, and so my dream in life is to be able to take a high-speed rail train to Chicago, so I don't have to, spend 6 hours in a car, 6 hours on the bus. There is a train that goes from Cincinnati to Chicago, but it only runs 3 times a week, and it's like at 2 a.m. So I want to be able to get on a high-speed rail train, take me to Chicago in 2 hours. Feels reasonable. I think it's important for those of us who want these massive projects to recognize that no major infrastructure is without some kind of cost and without some kind of impacts. And when we're talking about these impacts, we're often talking about, will infrastructure displace the people who are around that infrastructure? So it's a really important conversation to have and be honest about the impacts. So what I'm going to sort of take you through next is thinking about how we understand those impacts and the costs and how we document them. So here's where we're going to do a pop quiz. We're going to see how many of you are awake this morning. I'm going to show you 4 major infrastructure projects, and I want you to think about which one of these is not like the others and why. So the first is the Transcontinental Railroad. This is when railroads are built across the western United States in the 19th century. The second is the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a series of dams that are built in the Tennessee River region in the 1930s. The next is the interstate highway system. So this begins after World War II, and it's a series of interstate highways built across the United States over the course of a few decades. And the next is the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, which is built after oil reserves, massive oil fields are found in northern Alaska and Prudhoe Bay, and a pipeline is built to basically bring that oil to market. So does anyone want to guess which of these projects is not like the others and why? I would raise a hand or just shout it out. Yes. That's okay. That's a really, I see where you went with that, and that is sort of in the vein of our talk, but that's not it. I see a hand back here. Okay. You might not be wrong. All right. Well, your hint is that today we're talking about watersheds, right? And so if we go back, this was a watershed project. And so the Tennessee River Authority, the Tennessee Valley Authority is what is going to be our case study for the next few minutes here. Just to talk about why this is sort of, again, sticking out from the others, is the Tennessee Valley Authority had an original mandate for environmental protection. Those other infrastructure projects did not. So the Transcontinental Railroad, that is like the Manifest Destiny infrastructure project that's building out railroads for commerce and white homesteaders. The interstate highway system that begins as a national defense project. Eisenhower wanted to put the United States on equal footing with the Soviet Union in case of a very fast war mobilization effort during the Cold War. Of course, there was also a lot of commercial outcomes because of the interstate highway system. And the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, it's an oil pipeline, so that's pretty self-explanatory. But the Tennessee Valley Authority had this really unique mission that united both environmental protection and economic development. Now, to understand why this is so significant, you have to understand the historical context in which the TVA comes about. So we're talking about the 1930s and the New Deal. And the background for this is that 1929 is the stock market crash, right? So everyone who works in finance in New York starts freaking out. The country enters the Great Depression. Now, the stock market crash was in many ways sort of the finance industry catching up to what had already been happening elsewhere in the country. So elsewhere in the country, particularly in rural areas, farmers had really been in a bad situation for many years before the stock market crash. So stock market crashes, Great Depression begins. At the sort of high water mark of the Great Depression, unemployment reached around 25%. Herbert Hoover was president. Basically, Hoover kind of kept saying that the private market would solve all the problems. That was not the case. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is elected in 1932 in a landslide election, and he enters office with this real mandate to basically pull the country out of the lurch, sort of address these issues of mass unemployment and economic devastation. So the reason that the Tennessee Valley Authority was one of the first projects during Roosevelt's first 100 days was that there had been a lot of people who were looking at this region, which is anchored by the Tennessee River. So this is the watershed of the Tennessee River. And this area was among the poorest of the country, in a country that was already experiencing economic devastation. And you had a lot of economic development folks, and you had a lot of conservationists, so people who are interested in conserving natural resources, that were looking at this area and said, there's a way that we can solve a lot of these problems in one go. So the Tennessee Valley Authority is chartered with this mandate for 3 projects, 3 major outcomes. The first is soil conservation. So there was a lot of farming practices at the time that were thought to be kind of detrimental to the landscape. The second is that there was a lot of flooding in this area. So if there was rain, if there's a major flood event, sometimes that can wash away the topsoil that you want for farming. So that was the second thing, was sort of controlling the flooding on the river. The third was making electricity available to people. So in the early 1930s, if you lived in an urban area, so if you lived in Chattanooga or Knoxville, you probably had access to electricity, and you probably had for some time. But if you were someone living in a rural area in the early 1930s, particularly in this region of the country, you almost certainly did not have electricity. You didn't even have a light bulb in your barn or in your house. So the TVA is chartered with dealing with these 3 things: soil conservation, flooding, and electricity. And how are they going to do it? They're going to build so many dams that you wouldn't believe it. They're just going to be doing infrastructure week, all month, all year for several years. Now, today we don't think of dams as, there are actually now, we know, quite a number of environmental negative associations with dams. But at the time, it is really important to recognize that at the time, this was really viewed as a way of uniting environmental conservation concerns and economic development. And that's really profound because we often think of those as being sort of in opposition to each other today. But back then it was like, no, we're going to do both of these at once. We are going to lift this region out of economic devastation, and we are going to, basically make sure that the land here is not devastated even further. Of course, if you are building a lot of dams, the other side benefit of this is it's bringing lots of jobs to an area with mass unemployment. So within the first couple years of the TVA, they already start building several dams. Now, in order to understand the impacts of a dam on the area in which it's built, and if we have any engineers in the room, by all means, please correct me when we get to Q&A, because I know I'm probably going to screw up a little bit of this. But to understand the impacts of a dam, you have to kind of understand how a dam works. So a river is always flowing, right? And you have a dam sort of functions as a door or a gate in the middle of the river. That door or gate can be opened or closed to control the flow of water downstream. So if you're having a bunch of rain upstream, you can sort of choose how to control the opening or closing of the dam to mitigate flooding downstream. Within that dam, you can also have a bunch of turbines that, as the water passes over it, they can power a generator. And that's how you can create very cheap electricity from these dams. So this is where the term hydroelectric power comes from. Now, if you stick a door or a gate into the middle of a flowing river, what's going to happen? Water's going to back up behind it, right? And that is on purpose. This is how a dam of this type works, is you create what's called a reservoir, which is effectively an artificial lake. But also, what do we know about where people live? They often live near riverbanks. So what's going to happen to all of these people who live right behind that dam? This is when the Tennessee Valley Authority says, we're going to have to talk about what we do with all these families. This is where the TVA sets up. It goes by different names over the course of its history, but in some cases they call it family relocation. Sometimes they call it family removal. So this begins sort of a series of actions of moving people out of the dams. And so I'm going to show you some of the records of what this looks like. I just want to give you a heads up that there is outdated language that we would not see today in records that you see describing some of these families. So just want to give you a heads up as we go through some of these records. So all of these records are considered extremely significant government records. They are all preserved by the National Archives because they have so much significance for their genealogical value. They've also been digitized by Ancestry.com. So you have these case study workers that go out and they basically do a census and they say, who are the families living in these areas? So you can see there's a couple of different families in these examples, and you can see, sort of where they are, information about their family, children, and the type of work they do. These case study workers go out over a period of time and they talk about sort of what are the family's plans for moving. And then towards the end of this whole process, then they put together these sheets that say, here's where the family ended up. Now, here's one of the big challenges with moving families from this region. If you were a farmer who owned your own land, this is a relatively straightforward conversation because you have something that the government can buy. So the government can assess the value of your land, they can make you an offer and buy you out. And that is what happens for most of the farmers who own their own land. So most of them took the buyout. For the very few who did, it was like single percentages depending on the dam area. For those who refused, it went through eminent domain, which is types of legal proceedings to basically force people off. But many of the farmers in this area, I'll go back here, were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And so these were farmers who tenant farmers typically paid cash to a landlord to farm the land. Sharecroppers would pay a share of the crops. And they had usually very little, if anything, to sell. So what happens with these people is that they have to be connected to all sorts of different social service agencies to help them figure out where they're going to relocate to. And the legacy of this is a pretty mixed story. Some people wanted to get out of sharecropping and tenant farming, so they were happy to take a job with the TVA that paid them far more. Some people wanted to stay in agriculture, but did not have a pathway to do that because they didn't own their own land. So the legacy of sort of, did people end up better in the reservoir areas? Did people end up better than they started? Is kind of a mixed bag. But the reason that I bring this forward as an example of something for us to look at is that we are talking about people whose homes were underwater, right? After the reservoir inundation began. And so as we are thinking about areas around America's coastlines that will eventually be underwater, potentially in the next 100 years, will there be a process of actually assessing what these homes and communities look like and trying to connect them to resources? Or will it be the path that we're currently on right now, where it's just like, good luck, hope you figure it out, right? So any good archivist will tell you that you have to look at different types of records to understand a story. So in addition to the government records we have oral histories, which have come to us through kind of some of the efforts of places like Western Carolina University, people talking about that sort of mixed experience, saying, you know, we lost our land, we also got jobs, so it's a complicated story. There's some amazing pop culture representations of these, by the way, most of the homes were actually removed before the water came in. So there's a scene from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, an old Coen Brothers movie, where the water comes in and there's a barn with a cow on top. That's not actually likely would have happened. That barn would have been removed. There's another great movie here on the left called Wild River. Great movie. Montgomery Cliff is this Tennessee Valley Authority agent who has to persuade a kind of a curmudgeonly older woman to move off the island. And in the meantime, he falls in love with her beautiful granddaughter. We also have lots of images of places that were what it looked like before those lakes. So this is near Fontana Lake, Fontana Dam, which is over in North Carolina. And the water today, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's this car here. The water today comes basically just up to that road. So we have this image of what things look like. So we're getting into the final stretch here, and I want to shift to a topic called shifting baseline syndrome. I wish I could take credit for this concept, but I can't. It comes from a man named Daniel Pauly, who works in fisheries research. And shifting baseline syndrome is sort of when people who work in fisheries think that what they are seeing in oceans or watersheds, that is normal based on when they start their career. But they may not realize that normal is always shifting, that the baseline is always shifting. And so if you started in fisheries work, 100 years ago, your experience of what normal is like is different from someone who started 50 years ago or even 10 years ago. I sometimes see this referred to as generational amnesia. I have mixed feelings about that term, so I'm curious for your own reactions. We could talk about that in Q&A. But this is, I think, really where we see the power of archives in terms of mitigating against shifting baseline syndrome, in terms of documenting the fact that things have not always looked this way. So I am vaguely obsessed with what's known as repeat photography. This is when you go to a point in the landscape and you take photographs of the same place over time. This is really powerful with glaciers. So for those of you who don't know this, the parts of the world that are experiencing climate change the fastest in terms of warming are the poles and the colder areas of the world. So glaciers have receded enormously over recent decades, and you can see how dramatic that is in this example from a glacier that, I forget where this glacier is. I want to say it's Montana. We don't think of repeat photography as being present in aerial photographs, but I would say it is. I have a background in urban geography. That was my undergrad training. And so I've always sort of been taught to think of cities as living ecosystems. So I think that when we think about the impacts of interstate highway systems, we know that the displacement of those communities often were disproportionate working class communities, were Black communities. This was especially the case in my hometown of Cincinnati. You can see on the left-hand side, this was an area known as the West End. There was a working class Black community and basically ripped in half through the construction of I-75. I don't know as much about your history of highway construction in Atlanta, but I have to imagine it's a very, very, very similar story to what we have in Cincinnati. So when I think about this, from the perspective of an archivist, I think about how if we are not proactively thinking about adaptation, then we likely will not have as many archives. Because again, you know, although the legacy of the Tennessee Valley Authority in terms of outcomes is certainly a mixed bag, the documentation related to it, the archives related to it are comprehensive. And that is because it was a proactive project, right? But when we are in these sort of policy periods where we're kind of just not really doing anything, or we're letting the insurance companies kind of drive where we think about living or rebuilding, we're not going to have as much of a comprehensive archival record as we could if there were proactive approaches to thinking about relocation. So the consequences of inaction, I really think there are four. The first is that without major record keeping, we don't know what hazards remain. So thinking about the Tennessee Valley Authority, they knew where all those houses were. They knew where everything was. So they were able to go ahead and remove things to make sure that, you know, if there's a boat coming down the river, it doesn't accidentally get sliced open by an old chimney under the water. We have a lot of sort of heavy infrastructure around our coastlines. So if our ports are shifting in the future, we don't want, you know, a major shipping container vessel coming in, dropping anchor, and oops, we realized there was an old chemical tank underneath the water from the old port. So we don't want things like that to happen. And so we need to have archives of our changing landscapes to mitigate those hazards. The second is that records are really important for adjudicating legal claims. So as I like to say, you can file a public records request with your local government, your state government, the federal government. You can't file a public records request with State Farm or Nationwide Insurance. And so when we're thinking about sort of protecting people's legal rights, who is creating these records, if it's just the insurance industry that is driving these questions about adaptation and not our governments taking leadership, then we could find ourselves in a real pickle in terms of protecting people's legal rights. The third is that we need these records for cultural and community continuity. I think that's especially powerful when you see like those oral histories, right? You might not be able to visit your grandma's house because unless you can scuba dive down to the bottom of a lake, but at least there's an oral history that sort of talks about what the family life was like. And then finally, I think these archives are really important for processing anticipatory grief. The topic of grief in archives is a really rich vein of scholarship right now. And when we think about how much we could potentially lose because of climate change, these records can sort of, I think, you know, they can't take away the pain of this, but they can at least help us realize that these things will be memorialized, they will be documented, and it would mitigate forgetting that some of these places existed. So there has been some great work on doing exactly this. And unfortunately, one of the main places that was funding it was the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, they had this amazing project called Cultural and Community Resilience, which was a grant that existed for about 2 years until it became a victim of DOGE. And so you can see this funding opportunity will not be reoffered. But this was really a project, and it funded a couple years worth of projects that was supporting archivists and historians and community storytellers, supporting them to go out and document how climate change is impacting their communities, which I think is really the work that we need to find a way to continue. So I want us to think about, and for those of you who might be hanging out with me in the afternoon for some of the afternoon events, this is going to be a major focus of what we talk about, which is what can be achieved locally. Because I think this is really where we focus our efforts in the coming years. You know, right now the federal government is a mess. It's total abdication of leadership in terms of anything visionary or progressive when it comes to climate change. But I think thinking about what we can achieve locally is not just a feel-good thing. If we go back to, I'll just go back to that photo of the man in front of the dam, because this is the importance of local work. So this man was named David Lilienthal. And part of the reason that he was tapped to work with the Tennessee Valley Authority early on was that before FDR was elected during the 1920s, he spent his career in Wisconsin working on public utilities issues. And so he was seeing how the electric companies were basically screwing over consumers, and they were enacting monopolies, and he used his power within the Wisconsin state government to say, you're not going to do that anymore. We're going to have public utilities, and if you don't bring down your costs, then the government will basically force you to bring down costs. And so he really became kind of a hero of the 1920s of really working against sort of this kind of economic monopolies and saying, no, there's no way we can't, there's no reason to charge people this much money for electricity. We can do it cheaper, and we will. And so by the time that FDR was elected, they were looking at all of these sort of local and state examples that had existed in the country prior to FDR's election. And they were saying, okay, now that the winds have shifted in Washington, D.C., what do we achieve in all of these different cities and states that now we can scale up on a national level? So that example of sort of David Lilienthal's work in Wisconsin, that was something where, you know, bringing down the price of electricity was just something that had started in Wisconsin and then ended up becoming this sort of major project. So that's what I want us to think about today, is what can we do locally to scale up for if and when things change on the national level. So with that, that's my talk, and I hope that we can have some good conversation in the next few minutes.
I can start us off with a question, actually. I recalled or remembered AMIA, the Association of Moving Image Archivists. Yes, talk that I went to a few months ago about documenting cultural heritage institutions that are at risk because of environmental degradation and climate change. And they kind of made a map of where these different institutions are and how they could possibly update or create emergency response for the fact that they are most at risk. And I wondered during a part of the talk, like, have you seen that for people and, well, just like the general public, and how archivists, or if archivists are getting that information to the general public about, you know, maybe you should consider this or maybe you should consider that? Like, are there any projects that archivists are doing right now for that?
I think this is an area that could definitely be explored further. Again, I think we see things that are reactive and not proactive. So reactively, we certainly see that a lot of times when there's a hurricane, we'll often see library schools that will basically have their students go out and sort of teach workshops about like saving your family history, you know, because sometimes the real sad thing is that sometimes people think, oh, like my family photo album got, you know, waterlogged and now it's ruined, so I'm going to throw it out. And archivists know, like, no, there are ways to save that. And so what I think we typically have, though, is kind of more reactive rather than proactive. Maybe you're giving me a good business idea. Like maybe we should like be working with ancestry.com or something that's like preparing your, like sort of like archivist prepper, right? Sort of preparing your family history, before hurricane season. I think it's a great idea. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
I have a question that's kind of like going back to your examples, the TVA records that you said are cataloged with ancestry.com, they've been digitized, is that correct? Has that happened for other large infrastructure projects? Has ancestry.com done that as well? Or was the TVA kind of like the example that you were aware of that you, because I've worked on these large projects all over the Southeast, and you generally see families that actually got moved multiple times because of large federal projects. And so this was, it's always been like a kind of a research question in my mind. It's like, what's the kind of large number of people that have been relocated? And so this is the first time I've seen a really comprehensive set that's actually digitized. Otherwise, it's very difficult to find that information.
Just repeat it. Oh.
So yeah, I mean, the question is the TVA information catalog with ancestry.com unique, or are there other examples of infrastructure projects that have similar archive material on ancestry.com?
The question is the TVA project, the infrastructure project that was digitized by ancestry.com, one of the only types of projects that was treated this way, or are there other examples of large infrastructure projects that have been documented comprehensively like that?
I wish I knew a good answer to that question. So I just know that when I started going to look for TVA case files related to family relocation, that it was very obvious that, yes, it was a partnership with ancestry.com. I think if you go on ancestry.com and say, look for the names of the folks that are in there, it will come up with, it will show you those records, but I don't know if I think your question was really interesting because it got to this question of tracing people over time, right? Because you're right, a lot of times families did kind of move around more than once, which was also not unusual for the Depression, right? During the Great Depression, there was a high degree of mobility. There were actually a lot of people during the Depression that moved back from cities back to the family farm because they said, well, if I can't get a job, at least I can go to the family farm and grow food to feed myself. So, yeah, that high degree of mobility, that's, I think, a really interesting question I don't know the answer to, of whether there's enough that's been digitized to trace that kind of movement and mobility over time. Great question.
I think that I think a good question about that too is like how archivists maybe are employed to do that work through some of these programs. Like, I don't know very much about the FDR 100 days, if there were archivists who were hired to do some of that work, or if we can count, some of the photographers who, essentially documented that time period for us, as you mentioned, as the archivists who are doing the work kind of.
Make a quick comment on that. So this is where I get to shamelessly plug my work, Green New Deal for Archives, because one of the things that I talk about in that, so Green New Deal for Archives, the keystone of that is talking about some of the New Deal programs that really resulted in these massive record-keeping enterprises. And one of them was a project called the Historical Records Survey. And this is when the United States government, under a program called the WPA, which people think, oh, the WPA, they're the ones who built all the bridges. But they also did amazing things like doing the Federal Theater Project, where there would be like playwrights who would do these amazing plays. One of the WPA projects was the Historical Records Survey. And at its peak, I forget my exact numbers, but at its peak, it hired something like 5,000 or 6,000 people to effectively work as archivists across every county in the United States. Those archivists would go and basically survey all of the government, all of the local and county government records. Sometimes they would also look at church records. And this is really significant because what they did was they put together all of these guides for here are all the known records that are extant for local, state, church records, whatever, as of, 1936. But at its peak, when they had something like 5,000, 6,000, whatever the number is that I wrote about, that number was more people back in the 1930s hired to do archives work than the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates are working archivists today. During the Great Depression, we hired more people to do archival work than we have doing archival work today. And so this is kind of why when I talk about these things, I always anchor them to historical precedent, because I say I'm not asking for utopia. Utopia implies it's never been done before. This has been done before, but it's going to take a lot of people changing the political winds of this country to make that possible again. Also, just another quick shameless self-plug. If you can't tell, I'm obsessed with this era of history, the New Deal, and I have a podcast called No Time for Fear. It's all about the history of the New Deal.
Thanks for bringing that up, because now all of that conversation I did read the book, and all that conversation just made me remember. Yes.
This moment we're in of a federal dismantling of record keeping, and there was a great Republican article about that last week. But just think of environmental data alone, not just things like maternal mortality and gun-related deaths and all those things that CDC gathers that they're not gathering now, but just EPA data on climate change, federal government not collecting that data. It seems an effort to say, well, it's not happening. So that way that data collection or the lack of data collection shapes the storytelling I think you really raised. And part of that, I think, is highlighted in the TVA story, where the data that wasn't collected is the gross inequity around the TVA projects, because the records you showed didn't really tell the narrative, which was the truth, which is these people were displaced because they were poor, because they were minority, they were indigenous people, they were Black, whatever. And so I guess I wanted to hear your reflections on our massive federal destruction or dismantling of our record keeping, and also on the general lack of data in the historical record to represent what's really going on the ground that can lead to such green watersheds, people thinking TVA was a good project, which was atrocious, right? So.
The question is around kind of discrepancies in the record not representing the demographics of people who are often most impacted by these projects that are touted as, grand, wonderful things that everybody loved. The discrepancies between the records, like showing both of those sides, and how there's kind of a current moment of not even collecting records at all, which kind of gives the impression that things aren't happening when they are.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'll tackle the TVA part first, and then the what's currently happening part second. So I think I don't personally agree with the assessment that everything about the TVA was atrocious. I think that especially if you look at the public utilities part of it, there was the private market was not building out electrical infrastructure to these poor farmers, because they said they'll never be able to pay. They're poor. Why should they have electricity? And so I do think that it's important to recognize that this project did electrify that region because the private market had failed. So that's why I do agree that it is really important to acknowledge that
doing big infrastructure projects will have impacts. That's sort of, there's no way to do a big infrastructure project without impacts. I think then that gets into the really good question that you brought up, which is how do we measure those impacts, right? Because we have to recognize that anything that we do, I want high-speed rail from Cincinnati to Chicago, but I know that the cost of that is going to be some people's houses along that track. And I don't think the answer is to say, well, we don't build new infrastructure anymore, because the infrastructure we have right now is not going to bring us into the climate change, to the climate adaptation future we need. So then the question becomes, okay, if we know that infrastructure is going to have impacts, how do we, mitigate against those impacts, which is where I think environmental justice principles come into effect, which is that we know that if we do not center environmental justice, which is recognizing that working class communities, communities of color have contributed the least to climate change and are harmed the most by it. So if we do not center environmental justice in any climate adaptation efforts, you're right, that basically we're going to get climate gentrification. And that's happening in places like Miami, by the way, where a lot of the sort of historic working class, like Black communities, Haitian communities, those are all being priced out by people who are buying on high land. And this is because we do not have any kind of environmental justice embedded in our legal frameworks. Now, under the Biden administration, we started to have that, but you can guess where that's going now. So then I think this gets back to your very good question about how we measure things, because I totally agree with that, which is that they're not measuring it, because if you measure it, it shows that there's issues, right? It shows that there is like endemic racism in this country. It shows that there's endemic, frankly, a war on poor people. But if you don't measure it, then it's not a problem you have to solve. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a concept within archival work called the duty to document. And this is something that I'm really interested in learning more about myself, because what we are seeing is sort of like the government not taking, they're not following record keeping laws, right? They're putting war plans in Signal. So this gets to the fact that, government has to be accountable to people. It has a duty to document, but frankly, so does the private sector. And the private sector, there are no record keeping laws, except for, if it's a publicly traded company. So again, I can FOIA, I can file a Freedom of Information request with the federal government, but I'm very limited in the type of information I can get from statewide or State Farm or Nationwide, even though internally, a lot of these insurance companies have analytics. They're saying, you know what, we aren't going to underwrite mortgages in this area in 10 years, but we don't have to disclose that. So I think it's really important that when we're talking about this and we think about the impacts, it's not just the craziness happening in Washington, D.C. with Trump and Elon Musk. There's also a lot of accountability measures for the private sector. But because historically the government has been so hands-off with the private sector, except for, frankly, during the 1930s, the private sector gets away with a lot of things that would not happen in other countries with stronger legal frameworks. So sorry, this turned into like another keynote, so I think I should stop now. But thank you for that question, because it's a very important one to engage with.
That was great. Yes. Oh, probably have one or two more questions we can do.
How do you feel about generally, very bad asking specific questions. What do you feel like, look at it, what do you feel like the correlation between environmental economics, journalism, and just overall climate change has affected the evolution of research that can be documented statistically?
Can you talk about the intersection between environmental journalism, research, and just the way that we can look at research now? The intersection of three things. I'm sorry, I missed two. Environmental economics, journalism, and statistics, the correlation between.
Yeah, it's a great question. I hope I can talk a little bit if it's okay, I'd like to talk a little bit more high level about sort of the relationship I see between journalism and archivists and environmental issues, if that's cool. So I've had the great fortune to talk with some environmental journalists in my work before. And I remember, I think there's a fundamental difference between the way archivists and journalists approach our work, which is archivists are slow. That's kind of by design. Journalists are fast. They want a quote yesterday. They're on a deadline in an hour, right? And so figuring out a way to sort of bridge that gap. I know how to talk to journalists, but a lot of archivists don't. And they're just like totally freaked out by an hour deadline on something. So I think my impression sometimes is that I see as an archivist that there's so much like data and sources out there that could be used in journalism and that should be used in journalism, but it's not accessible to journalists in the way journalists work. And so I'm always thinking, okay, because I'll read a story and I'll be like, oh my God, they should have looked at this, this, and this. Why didn't they look at that? And it's like, well, because they're on a deadline and they don't know, and they know other journalists, right? They don't know archivists. So I think that's a really big, I don't want to tell journalists to do their work differently because like they're dealing with similar structural issues, frankly, as archivists, which is sort of a collapse of funding, a collapse of support. But yeah, I think that in terms of that kind of statistical analysis, I mean, maybe that's where like there can be some partnerships, right? Learning from journalists, like what do they need to do data-driven stories that are based on archives, and how can archives think about digitizing things, putting it in different formats to facilitate that and make it possible.
That sounds like a good conference too, like a good conference to put together.
And how much work and research has been done to correlate with now? What comes to mind right away is some of those stories that have been shared in community, and more specifically, what comes to mind is in African American communities, where you might have more of a reluctance to talk about it. But somewhere nestled in those oral history projects are the little nuggets. I wanted to know if any research has been done to tease that out.
What kind of research has been done to tease out the information about environmental history and justice that you can glean from oral histories?
Yeah, that's a great question because it gets at how do you define environmental information, right? Which I'm like, oh, environmental information is everything. I will confess that oral histories is not sort of my I don't have a huge background in it, but I do know that we have oral history experts in the room. So, yeah, I mean, I think the example that I showed, I think is really so important because actually if you listen to that oral history, right, it is such a ambivalent legacy, right, of how people felt about this. But they talk about the kind of environmental things of, okay, well, once they built the dam, then we had a lot more fish to fish from the lake. So I think this gets actually sort of similar to the question that we just had about how you surface that information, right? Because if you have, say, transcripts from oral histories, and then you're kind of putting them into some data analysis model that can surface that, then that sort of can give you kind of that information about, wow, we have all these oral, I'm thinking, for example, I know that there's a podcast in Cincinnati where they have done basically an oral history podcast of the Black communities in Cincinnati that were displaced because of I-75 construction. And so we might not think of that as being environmental history, but I bet if you went and took all that podcast and did some analysis on it, you'd probably hear people talk about like, well, these were the trees that were in my backyard. And then if we then go look at a map, we're like, oh, now there's like average than higher temperatures, maybe because all those trees were lost, right? So I think that work you're talking about is possible, But how you sort of pull it out of those oral histories is sort of the same question as how do we pull this information out so journalists can use it? Yeah.
I have a podcast that I started in an effort to bring awareness in largely environmental injustice communities in the Atlanta area, but not just in the Atlanta area. So the idea is that if we pair our everyday stories and then insert the facts about the environmental injustices that are taking place in your communities, then you're informed. So the whole idea is to better inform these communities because they're not necessarily going to go looking for it. So we have to kind of bring it together with their interest in mind, kind of like an ethnography approach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd love to talk about podcasts with you sometime. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Eira. And thank you, everyone, for being so engaged in your great questions.